Trent Burnard. Live. I thought we'd do something a little bit different today. I'm going to put a lot of ums in here to make our editor work through, earn her keep. So Trent and I, we're going to launch into a new sort of avenue for the podcast for a couple of months, just to look through history at some pretty amazing leaders. Well, not amazing necessarily. The first one's not amazing. Hitler. He was a leader. Yeah. And we're going to go through and talk about these leaders, and I'm going to give you an introduction into them, and then around a score around, what was their inspiration, motivation, score, providing purpose and direction. We'll give them a score for that as well. Roll into their leadership style. Again, another score, 7 out of 10 for Hitler. We'll get into that in a minute. And you see what I did there? That's like a hook, like 7 out of 10. Now they're going to listen until they get to that. Then we're going to go through enduring legacy, score out of 10, how it ended for them, score out of 10, and an overall leadership summary and a final score out of 50. So interestingly, those modalities, how it ended, enduring legacy, leadership style, what was the other one? Providing purpose and direction, inspiration and motivation. They're all sort of pillars to what would be coined these days as an adaptive leadership framework. So we're looking at these leaders through an adaptive leadership framework, providing them a score out of 50. And then, you and I have a bit of a chat about them, but we will also talk about those different modalities and how people might be able to take some things away from these people and put it into their own leadership styles. Maybe we won't be too contentious with the first one with Hitler. Probably don't want to take too much away, but yeah, we'll get into it. Alrighty, so first I'm joined today by my mate Trent. Trent and I are going.
Bram, how you going?
Good. We're going to pull apart Adolf Hitler, and I'm going to go through a little bit of a background first. So for those that don't know, Hitler was the Führer of Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1945. He was born in 1889 in Austria. I think he was pretty poor, actually.
Yeah, quite poor
Serves me correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was present at the First Battle of Ypres. Am I saying that right?
Ypres.
Ypres.
Yep.
I've said Ypres for years. He was in the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Arras, and the Battle of Passchendaele. And he was actually wounded at the Somme. And these, of course, were all First World War battles. He was a lance corporal. Is that right?
Yeah, a lance corporal, yeah.
And he may have even been a full corporal by the end of the war. I'm not sure. No, I think he was a lance corporal. And prior to that, he was a painter before he joined the German army.
He actually got rejected from the arts college in Vienna as well, from memory.
Yeah. He received a first-class Iron Cross upon recommendation by his Jewish superior, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann. That's interesting.
Yeah, interestingly, he actually received 2 medals for bravery. Was never promoted past corporals, as his superiors didn't see leadership qualities in him.
Whilst in hospital after recovering from being blinded by mustard gas, he heard Germany had surrendered and allegedly was so enraged he fell blind again. In that case, began a career in the NSDAP.
It's the forerunner to the Nazi Party.
Yeah, which would become the Nazi Party in the 1920s. So he was quite a strange cat prior to and during the war, really, wasn't he?
100%, I think.
Yeah, and again, these are my scores. They're not necessarily Trent's scores, so we can have a little bit of a talk about that. But inspiration, motivation, how did he inspire and how did he get people to do the things that he wanted them to do? and what did they use to motivate others, I gave him 10 out of 10 for this. And the reasons being as such. Hitler was an effective public speaker. In fact, a lot of current linguists and people who work around marketing, they look at not only Hitler but also Winston Churchill. And you and I use some of this in our own business, where you use the power of threes. So you say things in parts of threes because people seem to remember the patterns and go with that sort of melodic pattern forming. So he was a really effective public speaker.
Yeah, I would go as far as to say he was highly effective. In fact, that's what led him to become the leader of the Nazi Party, was his ability to be that fantastic orator. He was able to convert what was essentially anti-Semitism views and morph that into his beliefs around the Aryan race and those sorts of things. So, and he did that through the power of his own speech.
Yeah, right. And I mean, that was pretty big. It's still quite big in some of the colleges in London, debating. And I think it's probably a bit of a lost skill, actually, but it was definitely something that everyone did. And if you look back all the way to the Greeks, it was people that could stand up and actually do debating and make these great speeches were really revered. He drew long bows between reality and radical Nazi ideology to opportunistically exploit German political economic crisis as being orchestrated by sort of anti-German fifth columns, with Jews, Freemasons, communists, gypsies and homosexuals being targeted as corrupting and destroying Germany from within. So, I'm not going to draw any parallels, but there are parallels to the way that media can be used to go down rabbit holes with social media, in particular on YouTube and Facebook, to have all these conspiracy theories. So very, very much around, let's have all these different sort of groups and these conspiracies around those groups. And I guess this is seen in the propagation of the stab in the back myth that Germany was betrayed by Jewish and communist politicians into surrendering after World War One. The Great Depression allowed Hitler to accuse the Jews and the Bolsheviks of economically destroying Germany for their own gain, capitalised on German shame after World War One defeat and their subsequent economic losses in the Great Depression, and directed blame to these groups to build political support and a political base. The Nuremberg rallies would draw crowds of hundreds of thousands to indulge in Nazi propaganda, using Reichstag fire of 1933 as an excuse to inspire fear of communist plot, convincing President Hindenburg to give him emergency powers to restrict the rights of Germans who opposed Hitler, paved the way for political success.
Essentially, at that point in time, he was able to convince Hindenburg to essentially make him the unchallenged leader of the party, and went about disassembling his opposition from that point in. So, he was unchallenged after that point in time as a result of the Reichstag fire.
Wow. So some pros.
Well, he never had to face the popular vote as well after that point, because he was operating under those emergency powers. So if we were to talk about his, and a lot of people talk about him being able to motivate the populace, in reality, he never did face a democratic election after that initial election that he got in. And then, in fact, in that particular election, they actually lost seats. I think it was something along the lines of 30 seats because it was equal representation. And they actually lost 30 seats prior to from their previous election high, which was in about 28 or 29.
So basically, it wasn't democracy that led to someone like him. He didn't win the popular vote.
He did. He got in initially, but on a downhill slide, and then he maintained power as a result of the emergency powers that he convinced Hindenburg to give him.
Interesting around the American sort of college ballot system and the way that works. You can not have the majority of the people but you can end up winning the presidency. Yeah, back to Germany. So able to effectively inspire and motivate people to follow his vision through his public speaking and seizing on post-World War I German attitudes. Another pro, his inspiration and motivation propelled him to achieving political leadership. So he obviously won over the right people, sort of inkblot theory. He seized on...
Just sort of, I guess, going back on that that first point, you're talking about motivating people to follow his vision through his public speaking. That's what I was referring to previously with his ability to be that great orator. But he was highly adept at cherry picking what he believed the people saw as important at the time. He was really, really good at that. And so, to give you an example, he, in his early years, worked out that the people themselves were keen on the image of the German leader being strong and an imposing and towering figure. And that's why you see a lot of the psyops, a lot of that propaganda from those particular points points in time are photos taken looking up at him, so he has that towering and imposing figure, or a long way back, so you can't see how short he actually is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there was a lot of cherry picking attitudes, to what suited his end.
It reminds me of Jocko Willink. All the photos of him from the floor and looking up make him look absolutely massive. You meet him in real life, and he's
still massive.
No, he's not very big at all.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I've just lost another 20,000 listeners who think I'm bagging out Jocko. I'm just saying he's not 6 foot tall. Okay, so Hitler seized on some opportunities like the Great Depression, Reichstag fire. What was Reichstag fire?
It's the parliament.
The rally.
The parliament, the Reichstag.
Okay. Yeah. Further inspired and motivated those of his vision through weaving his false theories. So the other pro that his inspiration and motivation built enduring support for implementing his vision. So he had this vision. He was able to inspire people and motivate them to do what he wanted them to do because they wanted to do it, right? Which is the basis of leadership. Get someone to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. And he was able to draw on their actual heartstrings in all different ways to get them motivated.
Yeah, I guess that's where the contentious part of Hitler's leadership starts to come into the conversation, doesn't it? I mean, why did they want to do it? There is certainly discussion around, whether they actually believed Hitler's vision, but certainly the political elites and the military leadership, and definitely the public in those early years, absolutely 100% believed and were getting behind. And I don't mean everyone, clearly, but a large percentage of them was certainly getting behind Hitler's vision at that time.
Yeah, and I mean, what we're sort of
because they wanted
around the elephant in the room, I guess, is we're talking about the destruction or genocide of a people.
Yeah, the Holocaust.
And there was people who he had doing to do it. I mean, there were people who were complicit.
And the greater majority of the elites that were certainly in power and arguably somewhat sycophantically, but they believed in what Hitler was doing at the time as well.
Yeah,
for sure.
Wow. So that's the pros. The con, well, it's not really the pros, but it is the pros. The cons: his theories of stab in the back, communist, Jewish, they were all just myths. So they were exposed, or if they were exposed as untrue, would destroy his credibility. However, they were widely believed, so it's a moot point, really.
Chose to believe it.
Yeah. So as far as motivation, really, most of the population, so 10 out of 10. And it's important to note that the Germans, they're good people. Like this is the thing that it was amazing that they got these good people. At the end of the First World War, the environment was ripe for someone like him to come along and to try and raise them out of the depression and turn it all into, why is this about it's about us, you know, and so the people were, they wanted to do what he wanted them to do.
I guess these schools have a position in time as well. I would argue that as the world's falling in on Germany and the Soviets are coming through the eastern edge of Berlin, they probably weren't as supportive and as motivated as maybe they were probably 4 or 5 years earlier.
Yeah, it's a good call, and I guess we're talking about right at the height of their powers as far as this goes.
Yeah.
Providing purpose and direction, again, 10 out of 10. So this is around how you envisage goals, mobilise people and resources to achieve the aims. So did this person create a vision that people look to and work towards? How do people, society work towards this vision? Was it consistent and coherent, or beset by challenges? And in Hitler's case, 10 out of 10, he looked to establish a militaristic, racially pure German state that would achieve European domination through creating the greater German Reich, incorporating much of Eastern Europe into the German state. He achieved this through mobilisation of the people and resources to indoctrinate the population with Nazi ideology, and then mobilise resources towards economic recovery and wider militarisation. It's really similar to what we see in some bigger countries now. It's really similar to what the American military industry does.
Yeah,
it's hard not to call it out, mate. You know, I've seen it from that. I've seen it from that perspective. You know.
It's also. I mean, it's interesting because
we do it too. Australia does it too. China's doing it as well.
For sure. But it's interesting to talk about his efforts at pulling Germany out of post World War One. That's easy to do, I guess, when you're mobilising for World War Two. And that came,
and you know it,
and you know it, but the others don't know it exactly. And increasingly in the lead up to sort of 1939, it was all at the expense of consumerism, consumer goods. Whole factories were being converted from making baby food to making combat rations.
Right.
And there's examples like that everywhere. Cars, civilian vehicles were, not being produced anymore, or certainly in lower numbers, in favour of armoured vehicles. So
let's talk about some of the ideological indoctrination. This is amazing, right? In 5 years, schools started teaching Nazi ideology as fact, the superiority of the German. There was any anti-German art and media was banned and revised into having art which promoted German superiority. It spread to different areas of society. So unions' goals became working for the betterment of Germany, not the benefit of workers themselves, due to the unions being amalgamated into the Nazi single union, the German Labour Front. Workers were rewarded with state-paid holidays, get this for progressive, maternity leave and pensions as a reward for their service to the state. The Hitler Youth was formed.
No, that's servitude.
Yeah.
That's servitude.
Yeah. 5 years. Hitler Youth, Maidens League indoctrinated kids to Nazi ideology. So the Maidens League were the ones indoctrinating the boys to be militaristic and strong, and women to be devoted to motherhood and producing Aryan children. My God.
Yeah, so that's just before you go on, that's a really important point too, and I think it's overlooked because in the latter year of the war, so in 1945, there were soldiers and officers entering the Wehrmacht and the SS who had really only ever known Hitler.
Yep.
They were actually far more indoctrinated because they'd gone through this process.
Yep.
They were far and away more indoctrinated than their parents.
Jochen Piper, who was a Panzer Division commander towards the end of the war, he lost a heap of men early on in the war, and he maintained continuity through the Panzer Division. And towards the end of the war, he had Hitler Youth. And these guys had their dads and their grandfathers had died during World War II in the start of it. And these young guys, these young 18, 19, 20-year-olds, yeah, they couldn't drive a Panzer. And most of them couldn't shoot, but they were absolutely fanatical. It was scary. And he even made mention of the seasoned warriors I had at the start from World War One were great soldiers and brilliant tacticians, but these people were terrifying. These kids that he had were terrifying on the battlefield. And, you know, they're now, what are they now? They'd be now, you know, most of them are probably dead now. But at the end of you know, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the years later, these were 30, 40-year-old, 50-year-old Germans.
It's the 1940s version of radicalization. I mean, they were literally radicalized by this form of leadership.
Yeah, I'll go into some more of the radicalization, and then we might even talk briefly about, you know, a guy who I really admired, which was Otto Skorzeny. And the fact that he was like an officer and a gentleman, he was a sword fighter, blah, blah, blah. But he would have seen all this going on around him. And he loved Germany, but he wasn't necessarily in love with the idea of, you know, of what was going on. The same as Rommel. But anyway, so...
We should talk about Skorzeny.
Yeah, we'll do one about him. So organizations punished anti-Nazi dissent and created the SS Gestapo, the SS and the Gestapo. Army swore allegiance to Hitler, creating ideological link between Hitler and army. You could talk about military occultism in Germany to show extent of radicalization.
I think
that was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, his form of leadership really isn't an occultization
national occult, yeah.
Yeah, it's quasi-religious.
Religion suppressed, many forced to adapt religions to suit Nazi ideology. Populist support for reclaiming German territories lost in World War One, and this is really big point. And this extended to support from ethnic Germans outside Germany to be reincorporated into Nazi Germany. So reincorporating Saarland in 1935, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, Anschluss 1938. God, I just want to go traveling again. Sudetenland 1938, annexation of Bohemia 1939, and demands for Danzig. I mean, if you couldn't see that this was leading to all our expansionism, and I think Europe could see that, but they didn't have much to do about it.
Yeah, effectively,
because the whole population was rising.
I agree.
If you look at Paris in the same time, you know, they were setting up what they thought was is it the Maginot Line? They were setting up a line of defences, but the whole population wasn't behind.
They all knew.
The whole population wasn't behind defending Paris or France, whereas the whole German population is now, hey, surprise, yeah.
Regained those lands and the economy's improving. There's jobs, even though the Deutschmark wasn't exactly worth a whole lot. People had gainful employment, but it was all towards expanding these boundaries. You know, it was that Rhineland in 1936. I mean, that was Hitler's personal idea. Was regaining those boundaries. But even at that point in time, in 1936, the generals weren't behind him. Well, they certainly weren't supportive of the reoccupation of Rhineland.
Yeah, right.
And he forced them.
So that shows you that he was able to provide purpose and direction, and that was through state-sponsored and statewide ideological indoctrination. And then you've got resource mobilization. He restructured the German economy, which resolved the Great Depression for Germany pretty early, actually. State-directed investment in infrastructure development saw expansion of Volkswagen, the Autobahns, Krupp, Stell, and other industries. The Autobahns provided both civilian and leisure infrastructure, but importantly, it was actually designed around military infrastructure to move things fast as their overall plan.
Heavy vehicles and armored vehicles, and that's why the Autobahns existed.
Yeah, highways that the only highways in Europe that could move things around a country that fast. And this is from a country that was broke, and businesses. Go on.
As I said before, it's at the expense of the consumerist part of the industry. So it was really a very thin veneer on fixing the economy because there was no depth to that economy at all, and it came at the expense of quality of living standards as well.
And then you had the Treaty of Versailles, where they weren't able to make an offense force, so they made a defense force. So everything they were doing was
pocket battleships and things like that.
Yeah, so interesting. And then, so the pros of all this, it created effective mechanisms for providing direction. So you've got education, Hitler Youth. It instilled purpose and direction in his ideas into the German people. There was direction and purpose to achieve Hitler's vision, which was embodied by all aspects of society: labour, industry, commerce, religion, the military, obviously, allowing Hitler to provide cohesive cooperation and direction across the population.
Yeah.
It created positive cycle for Hitler's leadership, that inspiration that you talked about before, and leadership which would allow Hitler to provide that direction and purpose through schemes and mechanisms which would see further inspiration. So him standing on the dais almost, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler. Saw Hitler's vision for the most part was achieved before and during the start of the war, especially when they had that amazing blitzkrieg at the start, and that really sort of lit the home fires behind how great the Germans were. There was no challenge to his leadership due to huge support, absolutely massive support, and any challenge that was there sort of dissipated. And it
until those planned attempts to overthrow him. But as I said,
that's why years later.
Yeah, that's years later. But the political elite at the time were supportive. They did believe him. They were being empowered as a result of Hitler being there. They were all getting their bit. They all had their snouts in the trough. They were all part of it. And of course, the Nuremberg trials, you saw these political and military elites trying to back out and indicate that they weren't supportive at the time. But, this was Hitler and some of these other key individuals at the time that were really leading the country down this path. But it's not entirely true.
And interestingly, it wasn't people his age group. So you're talking about, suddenly you had this guy and all the youth were like loving him. And then all of the World War I veterans who were, now in their, older years, and people who had watched the modernization of Germany who were in their 60s, 70s. So you had intergenerational support. And I guess so that's the pros. The cons to the way that he would provide purpose and direction was it relied on indoctrination and coercion rather than leadership and inspiration. So it was fragile.
And fear, because, in the early years, he was using the brown shirts and they just morphed, and Hitler Youth, obviously. But it went from the brown shirts to the black shirts, and there was a significant amount of fear involved. Yeah. Obviously, the Gestapo. So it wasn't just about indoctrination, but it was past coercion. It was fear and oppression.
And you had kids. Just before the war, you had Hitler Youth, you had young kids in their young teens, rounding up, Jewish sympathisers and handing them over to the Gestapo. Insane.
Well, the Gentile women who had Jewish boyfriends, they were forced, forced to have their heads shaved in public and publicly shamed, and by the brown shirts and the youth, all because they had a Jewish boyfriend.
I mean, it's all
crazy stuff.
It's almost the ISIS playbook,
isn't it?
Yeah. So the leadership style score 7 out of 10. I gave him for his leadership style, and I'll explain that because I know that you're going to go what?
Yeah, what?
as far as style, there's different styles of leadership, and he was a dictator. And then you've got a collaborative leadership style, participative leadership style, delegative leadership style. But, people who lead by example. But he was well and truly a dictator, and it was effective, and that's the score is effectiveness of his leadership style. Now, this is interesting. A lot of people won't know this. Even the people who are educated on World War II and Hitler won't know this. So Hitler ruled through a thing called the Führerprinzip. And the principle relied on absolute obedience of all subordinates to their superiors. Thus, he viewed the government structure as a pyramid with himself, the infallible leader, at the apex of that pyramid. promotion was secure through appointment by those of higher rank who demanded unquestioning obedience to the will of the leader. So that Führer Prinzip made things legal, that you otherwise wouldn't think would be legal. So doing things like hiding a Jewish person in your basement, that would be illegal. But firing squad or worse, that was legal as part of his ultimate obedience. So if he says yes, you can do it, then anyone below him can then tell someone below them to do it. Jeez.
Yeah, it's don't get me wrong. I have my own views on the leadership style score. I understand that this style of leadership is an extremely important style of leadership to understand, but it is essentially quasi-religious. He has effectively turned himself into a demagogue and justified, as you said, changing the laws because he said so. It's almost like leaders of 1,000 years before.
Yeah, I mean there is leaders out there like that now who actually have great communities and countries. I might point who are religious leaders. Yes. Anyway, let's not go down that path yet. And he would foster competition and rivalry between subordinates to protect a united threat to his power, as well as to have that naturally strong leader then rise to the top, as you would see with people like Jochen Piper, Otto Skorzeny, Goebbels.
Became a divisional commander.
Yep. He allowed ministers and subordinates to interpret and achieve his goals through interpreting those goals and then having that initiative to achieve it. So choosing their own mission, basically, which is a very, very sound way of commander's intent being interpreted.
Unless he took a direct interest, in which case he had the final say, and he increasingly gave himself more and more portfolios within the government, and obviously, it was not unlike him to believe that he could control all of the units on the battlefield down to some of the smallest sizes, such as battle group or battalion-sized organisations. He felt that he could control them all himself personally, and if he indicated that he wanted to, pull this lever here and deliver more ammunition, 88 millimeter ammunition or whatever it was, he would pull that lever and get involved. So you had
effective initially.
Well, I guess to some extent, but no one person has a monopoly on all the good ideas, and I'm just not sure that as increasingly as it started to come unhinged, the principle of this style of leadership started to unravel.
Yeah. He wouldn't write written orders. He'd communicate verbally, opening those orders up to varied interpretations and ways of achieving them. Some challenges to his leadership. Early in his career, the SA and its leaders grew in power. Hitler feared being deposed as head of the Nazi Party, so he just purged them in the night of the long knives to consolidate control. That's interesting.
Yeah, again, he didn't have to face opposition. He didn't, and he wasn't. After that last election, he was never called to account.
Then there was the Valkyrie plot, which sought to kill Hitler in 1944 due to his anti-Jewish policies, military defeats, and the desire for aristocrats to lead Germany, and that plot failed to kill Hitler.
So did the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that Rommel was part of that, was he not?
Yeah, he was.
Yep. And Hitler made all major decisions regarding Germany's military strategy, as you said before, so varied levels of success there. He ordered German military to occupy Norway, France, and the Low Countries in 1940, saw strategic success despite opposition to these offensives by German generals.
Yeah, well, that gave him the confidence to back himself in any argument. Those good wins, and they were good wins, were against the advice of the generals at the time. They opposed him on the reoccupation of Rhineland and the invasion of France. And as a result of that, from the 1940s, it confirmed his belief that the generals were timid and weak. And that's part of the reason why he rode them so hard. He was supportive of those strong ones coming through, but he expected that unless they proved themselves to him, that they were most likely timid and weak.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about this was that, Germany was opened up into two sides. So there was two fronts, and he saw it himself that it was his desire to be the general that was basically the general in chief or the commander in chief of the army and then he was the he would focus his efforts and his brain power into the war with Russia, with the Soviet Union, sorry.
Yeah.
While his commanders faced the Western Allies. So, and that ultimately led to his, downfall, Germany's downfall. His military, success was limited against the Russians. He couldn't make rational decisions. He had syphilis and Parkinson's disease at the same time and was taking this cocktail of drugs, so he wasn't making rational decisions at all. And he was making decisions quite often against advice of German generals. He was superstitious. He wouldn't move panzer divisions, which could have defeated the Allies at D-Day because he was asleep when generals made the request.
He also gave them the order that these units and formations were not to be moved unless he said so. So that allowed for poor commanders to absolve themselves of the responsibility of any tactical failures, and it forced good commanders to miss tactical opportunities.
Yeah, and right towards the end, when they were defending, Germany, when they were defending Berlin, he had this ludicrous idea to go and recapture oil in Romania, which with battle groups or divisions that didn't exist, which was. I think there's a movie that shows him losing his mind. That movie where they make out that he's
downfall.
Yeah.
It's a great movie.
It is a good movie. He never considered surrender, and died somewhere in a bunker, and his body was burnt beyond recognition. Apparently,
indeed.
World's greatest conspiracy. Yeah. Tim Kennedy's still trying to find him in South America. But anyway. Wouldn't be finding much of him now. So around his leadership style, a couple of pros. Führerprinzip effectively negated any challenge to his leadership. It was just all controlling. His personal style of leadership, with limited input from generals, saw effective implementation of military plans, especially the Blitzkrieg, which was really early successes and did have this more effective. Both the French and the British and even the Americans think that the German army might be unstoppable. And then Führerprinzip also allowed his orders to be implemented with initiative and flexibility in some regards, because nothing was on paper, so it was hearsay and innuendo. However, the cons to all that, his sole leadership coupled with increasingly deteriorating mental health saw no one able to stop or advise him from making any mistakes. So they couldn't stop D-Day. Failure to stop the launch of the Battle of the Bulge. They created factionalism, which split the Nazi leadership, when they needed leadership the most. And his dictatorial, is that a word?
Dictatorial.
I need coffee. Yeah. His dictatorial style created challenges to his leadership. Their failure mitigates this point, but demonstrates how it did alienate some of his inner circle. So it was effective until it wasn't.
Yeah, until it got hard. It was, again, fragile.
So enduring legacy, so continuation of ideas and personal adoration, how does history remember them? Not surprisingly, I gave him 0 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm I'm glad that you've said 0 out of 10 because I think even
up until now I was looking like a Nazi, wasn't I?
even by their standards of the day, the social standards of the day, and setting aside the fact that the German population themselves were feeling oppressed as a result of the Versailles Treaty and the implications of that. It was certainly obvious to much of the world that he was a dictator who was bent on destruction of the free world.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And the reason for that score, so no continuation of ideas. Nazism was destroyed in World War II. And reviled thereafter. So, yeah, Hitler has no real adoration except for the crackpots. Only widespread contempt. Almost everyone sees him as megalomaniacal, a racist, evil, murderous, paranoid, and bring unwanted chaos and destruction. Germany has shame. It's had to apologise profusely for this period of its
Extensive
history.
shame. A lot of their laws now in Germany are as a result of preventing something like this from happening again. But as Ricky Gervais would say, you don't hear of too many boys being called Adolf anymore, do you?
No. There's no enduring legacy. And historical dismissal of Hitler as murderous tyrant earns Hitler a 0.
Rightly so.
Yeah, how it ended for them. Again, I gave him 0 out of 10 for how it ended. And we've done a heap of these leaders for the coming weeks ahead, and some of them, it's 10 out of 10, But for him, he ended his own life, we think. His leadership ended in a bunker in Berlin, surrounded by his enemies, and instead of surrendering, just killed himself. So he didn't even give the world, that ability to heal through that. The Germany he created was not only defeated, it was split between capitalist West and communist East, and created an enduring legacy of pain for people right up until the late 90s, early thousands. So.
It was the complete destruction of his country. And if you think, 12 and a half years prior to that, when he started, he claimed that the Third Reich there was going to be a promised 1,000 years of the Third Reich. So by that maths, given that he was, in charge for 12 and a half years, he achieved about 1.2% of his goal. So, the complete destruction of his country. That's what happened. That was how it ended.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing good came out of that. Overall leadership summary, 28 out of 50, which sounds probably better than it should, but you have to remember he brought a country from its knees out of a depression, mobilized huge human resource, gave them positivity, motivation, and direction. It's just that it was in completely the wrong way. Imagine the power for good,
Yeah. If he'd gone a different way, if he'd been moderated or been able to be moderated by more moderate leaders, maybe, there still would have been anti-Semitism, but maybe not genocide. There still would have been expansionism, but maybe not taking on three major powers at once. No, I am not a fan of Hitler or his leadership style. I think he achieved it through propaganda, through lies and coercion and violence.
Yeah, I mean the score was given to him because of his ability to inspire, because of political ascension through motivational speaking and opportunism, which led him to be able to implement his political direction to creating his idol. Let me start again with that. So Hitler's ability to inspire and his political ascension through motivational speaking and opportunism led him to be able to implement political direction, creating his idealized German state through mobilizing all sectors of society. They obeyed his will, and they also pursued his envisaged Germany. So,
which as we've sort of discussed a few times, was crooked in its initial inception. I mean, it was and he was able to capitalize on the fears of the people. But when we talk about the legacy, it's a leader's responsibility to leave the world in a better place. He's hardly done that, has he?
No, and that lack of enduring legacy, the immediate collapse of Nazi Germany and defeat of World War II effectively washes away any long-term impact he would have even had, and diminished his leadership impact
for sure
considerably. So, all in all, not a very good score. It's not the lowest score, but it's not a very good score. Some things to take away, I think, probably the passion that he showed, if that's the right word, is something interesting for leaders to look at. And also the orating skills, his ability to mobilize people's minds through crystallizing a vision for them and then selling that vision widespread, building a fan base, which is part of what leadership is. He was very effective at that. So perhaps if you're thinking about yourself as a leader and you're looking at anything good that can come out of that nutcase, it's probably the ability to connect with a huge amount of people, to show them a vision of where you're taking your leadership end state towards. So you've been given a task, and now this is what that task looks like at its definition of done, to use a better term. That's probably the only good thing.
Yeah, certainly understood. The very early propaganda and really branding. He really branded himself in order to take on that Führer principle style of leadership.
Quite sophisticated, wasn't it?
Was extremely, and having studied a fair bit of propaganda and psychological operations, I think it was really quite effective. It took the Western countries a long time to start to counter that.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's the first one off the bat.
Lovely.
Hitler. I think we're going to do another one pretty soon. Let me just have a quick look and see what that one is. Oh, okay. Well, why wouldn't we do Churchill?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do Churchill next. There we've got, the two competing leaders pretty much. And then I think we're going to do, who are we going to do after that? Is it Ataturk? No, you know what? It's John Monash.
Fantastic.
And Ataturk, the Shah of Iran, Jimmy Carter.
Don't give all the.
Don't give them away.
Don't give them all away.
Okay. Anyway, I've got so this is Hitler this week.
Got some good ones coming though.
Next week we'll do Churchill. Hitler 28 out of 50. You got anything final to add before we wrap up for the day?
No, I think we've covered off on a lot of what made Hitler good and bad, predominantly bad, and you only have to Google was Hitler a great or good leader on YouTube to see the extensive amount of work and academia and publications that is all over the internet. And it's interesting to see both sides of the leadership debate. And personally, I don't have time for Hitler and as a leader. Sure, there's a couple of aspects there that are worth noting, but from the perspective of being an observer of leadership, he's not my cup of tea.
No, we've got some good ones coming up though. Hey, Trent,
looking forward to
joining me again on the podcast. Let's dissect leadership a little bit more through these amazing leaders over the next few months. Thanks, mate.
Cheers.
That was good. You were good.
You reckon?
Yeah. I'm talking through a mouthful of marbles today.
So I think I think with these scripts, because they are a script, it sounds like I'm trying to interrupt all the time. Maybe just pause for like a half a second at the end of a line, because
We'll see how she. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I'll send her an email and say, hey, can you really listen to this and just take out the ums and ahs, but also make sure it doesn't sound like we're interrupting each other or talking over each other.
Yeah, because I've got because I did a bunch of research in the lead up to this as well. And so what I was doing was converting that research into those notes. So I've got, read